Welcome to the Outthinkers podcast. Plug into fascinating minds and breakthrough ideas that are transforming industries and the world. I'm your host, Kayan Krippendorf, founder of Outthinker Networks, a global think tank comprised of corporate strategists, innovators, and entrepreneurs that are shaping the future of business. If this describes you, join us at outthinker.com. Now, let's dive into this week's episode.
Let's imagine we are building this product right now and we're collecting data and for a very specific purpose, right? All our intentions are great, but let's imagine that tomorrow we get a different CEO with fundamentally different values, but we still feel comfortable collecting the data and setting up the product the way that we're doing right now. And if the answer is no, then maybe we just have to go back to the drawing board and do a better job. So it's very easy to get carried away with the momentum, and we all want the best for the consumer without necessarily realizing that data that you collect, systems that you put in, are oftentimes permanent, right? Leadership of companies, of governments are not necessarily the true. So I think it's a nice way of thinking through these potential dark futures in the here and now and baking it into the process so that it just must go through before the product is launched.
That was Sandra Matz, the David W. Zalaznick Associate Professor of Business at Columbia Business School in New York, where she also serves as the director of the Center for Advanced Technology and Human Performance. As a computational social scientist with a background in psychology and computer science, Sandra studies human behavior and preferences using a combination of big data analytics and traditional experimental methods. Her research and the topic of this podcast uncovers the hidden relationship between our digital lives and our psychology, with the goal of helping businesses and individuals make, hopefully, more ethical decisions. We dive into some fascinating insights from her January 2025 book, MINDMASTERS, the data-driven science of predicting and changing human behavior, exploring the concept that she coined of psychological targeting, a discipline that reveals how our digital footprints expose intimate aspects of our psychology and can be used to shape decisions from what we buy to how we vote. In this podcast, we delve into this topic, discussing how digital technologies and AI are giving us an unprecedented ability to understand and target specific people in specific moments and specific states of mind. The profound implications, for better or worse, of this capability. Some exciting and concerning examples of what this might look like, from diagnosing mental health to crafting highly personalized automated marketing campaigns. What companies can learn from Apple's Evil Steve test in designing products and experiences to safeguard future ethical misuses of data. A glimpse into what could be a solution to the ethical dilemma of the capabilities that Sandra studies, what she calls federated learning, a new form of data modeling that protects the individual's data while delivering high-quality insights. Ladies and gentlemen, Sandra Matz.
All right, Sandra, thank you so much for being here. It is a thrill. I got to see a TED Talk that you gave a few years ago and so much more. It's nice to see it all come together in this book, MINDMASTERS. Thanks for being with us.
Well, thanks for having me.
I want to start with the same questions I ask all of our guests. The first is just to get to know you a little bit personally. Could have nothing to do with your work, intellectual interests. Could you complete this sentence for me? If you really know me, you know that.
You should not approach me before I've had my first cup of coffee. I think that you find that out really quickly.
Who's the Sandra that we meet before your coffee?
Before that, I'm just grumpy and not interested in anything. I think when you typically talk to me, I would say I'm curious, I'm excited, but just without coffee, there's nothing.
Gotcha. Great. And this is a podcast on strategy. So my question is going to be, and I've asked this question 140 times to 140 different experts, and we always get a different answer. What's your definition of strategy?
It's funny because I asked the same question to one of my colleagues once, because I'm in the management group at Columbia Business School, and I was put on the strategy search committee, and I had no idea. So I asked them, like, what is strategy? And they told me it's all about trade-offs. Still didn't know. So I think the way that I think about strategy is essentially you need to figure out what you want and what you don't want, and then figure out the steps of how to get there given the constraints. So that's my simple version of strategy.
I like that. What you want and don't want. Love it. Thank you. So there's so much I want to dig into here, and we won't be able to cover all of it. But I think it's, kind of start with the definition of psychological targeting. It's a term that you coined. Makes so much sense now that I've thought about it. So tell us, what is the definition?
Yeah, so the way that I think of psychological targeting is essentially two steps. One is, how do we take the data that we generate every day, everything from social media to credit card spending to the data that gets captured by your smartphone, turn that into psychologically meaningful constructs. That could be anything from personality, moral values, leadership qualities, mental health scores. And then as a second step, how do we tap into some of these insights, into these psychological motivations, needs, preferences, to potentially shift the way that you think, feel, and behave?
Gotcha. But it's becoming newly possible to do this differently than before, right? This is a big part. We're going to explore that, but just maybe at a high level, what has changed?
So, I mean, I think
to do this more.
It's a great question, because I think there's two almost waves in which this has changed. The first one is just the fact that we have all of this data, and that we then also had machine learning models that can take data and translate it into something like a psychological construct, and also distribution, right? So the fact that we can target people on Facebook, that we can send out content that is hyper personalized. That was the first wave, I would say. Second wave, and we might get to this more later, is AI has democratized them. I don't need a proprietary model anymore that translates something very specific into something else that's very specific. I can just pop something into ChatGPT and say, hey, here's the social media post of person X. What is their big five personality profile? What are their moral foundations? And then obviously also AI is incredible at taking some of these dimensions and creating content that speaks to someone who is extroverted, someone who is more impulsive, someone who is more neurotic. So that's a total second revolution, I would say.
Yeah, I understand. I hadn't thought of, I mean, you have the feedback loop, more information coming too, and then we have the customization loop, and AI being able to actually playing a role on both sides. Tell us a little bit about extrovert versus introvert. How do we know whether someone is one or the other?
It's a great question. And I'm just using them very liberally, because technically, so they're part extroversion is part of the big five personality framework. And that has these five traits: openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. And the way that they were developed was trying to capture differences in the way that people think, feel, and behave. And they're very relatively pragmatic approximations, right? It kind of collapses the complexity of who you are into your more extroverted, more open-minded, and so on. And they're usually not thought of as dichotomy. So I said like extroverted, introverted. It's usually a continuum. So you can be extremely extroverted anywhere to extremely introverted. And extroversion is one that we use quite a lot, because it kind of distinguishes the way that we interact with our social environment. So it's relevant for quite a lot of behaviors, like which jobs do you like, which music do you like, mental health. So it's just one of these dimensions that's just driving a lot of behavior.
Yes, right. So that's just one example. But the way that I did it, I have done my MBTI test, and I know I'm a INFJ, and I took a test and I thought about it and observed. But now the way that someone would know that I'm an introvert is very different, right? So how can that be done?
Yeah. So it used to be, as you said, like you take a test. MBTI is actually a bit challenging, because, as you said, it just dichotomizes, right? It puts you into one of these buckets. But essentially, instead of asking you questions, like extroversion questions would be, I talk to a lot of different people at parties. I'm the life of the party. I like socializing. I get energy from social interactions. So instead of asking you these questions, we can essentially just observe all of the traces that you leave as you interact with technology. So instead of asking you about whether you socialize with a lot of people, I can just see how often do you interact with other people by tapping into your phone sensors, for example, right? So just take your GPS location, and I know exactly where you are. So I might know that you are spending the night in a busy pub where there's usually a lot of activity happening. Or I can tap into your Bluetooth and see that you're surrounded by a lot of other people. I can check your credit card and again, see that you're hanging out at concerts and bars, or I can look at your social media where you talk about the fun weekend that you've had. So instead of asking you all these questions, I can just literally follow your footsteps and see what you've been up to.
What do you say to people who I'm sure often hear you say that and say, that feels really creepy?
I would say that's absolutely correct. So I do think it feels incredibly intrusive, right? So the fact that someone just purely based on the digital footprints that we leave can make inferences about, are you extroverted, introverted? Not just that, we can learn about your mental health, like your sexual orientation, whether you're neurotic or not, whether you're impulsive or not. So there's so many things that we can learn that are incredibly intimate. And I think it's absolutely right to be worried that this is not only possible, but it's also used by companies to then not just peek into your psychology, but potentially also use it to change the choices that you make.
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah, that's what we're going to get to, because up until now, it's been sort of identify a kind of generic profile of someone, a customer or a voter, and then send them from a selection of messages. Now I think we're talking about much more individualized, and the ability, because they're interacting with us, not just taking information in, there is now this feedback loop where we're actually able to influence behavior. Could you tell us
very much?
Little bit?
And so for me, the interesting part is, in a way, that's been the case. If you think about how did old school communication work, the salesperson was trying to figure out who's on the other side, make inferences about their preferences and psychology, and then adjust their communication to that. Now, fast forward, we're trying to replicate in a way the same thing online. We're taking your data, like those are the observations of the salesperson. We're turning it into insights and intelligence. And then we're using that intelligence to customize the pitch that we have, the content that we show, and so on. And again, AI has just put this on steroids, because you can automate the entire process all the way from, here's the interactions that I see with a customer, to, okay, now that I know who person X is, let me come up with a perfect messaging, with a perfect image to go with. And then based on my interactions with this content, I can optimize even further, right? So I don't necessarily rely on this initial relatively broad category of he's extroverted or introverted, but I can fine tune and zoom in even more.
Yeah. And you talk even about at the individual level, now we can even get more granular, because before your coffee, you were a different person than after the coffee. And so tell us about, because I've always been intrigued by that I have felt that my father's a communications professor. And I remember one thing that he wrote about was just that we have these different identities, that in the morning, I'm a commuter, in the afternoon, I'm a coworker, in the evening, I'm a husband, or, so talk to us a little bit, because I have not seen people really kind of dig into the fact that we have multiple eyes and multiple identities.
Yeah. And for me, that's one of the interesting new developments in personality psychology. So it used to be the case that we think of personality as something that is relatively static, right? So even if you have the multiple identities, usually it's just a puzzle that, okay, every morning you have this identity. It was rare that those identities clashed, right? Oftentimes it's true, we can act out of character. So if you're generally really introverted and your job requires you to be extroverted, you can totally do that, but it typically takes a toll. And now what we do know is that people are much more dynamic based on the context, right? So it's, even if you're very introverted generally, if you're surrounded by a lot of other people, or you engage in like an activity that's kind of social and it's exciting, most of us feel more extroverted in that moment than we typically do. The way that personality psychologists think of personality right now, it's as a distribution of states. So instead of having a one-time measure that says you're the 80th percentile on extroversion, we can sample, let's say, we can ask you 100 times over the course of 4 weeks, how extroverted do you feel right now? Like, how social do you feel right now? And we will get this distribution that still tells us something about your general tendency, right? Because the mean of that distribution is essentially, on average, if I don't know anything about the context that you're in, you're like somewhat on the 80th percentile. But then I also know that, well, maybe currently he's like surrounded by friends, he's like at this concert and he's having a really good time. So maybe I'm going to adjust my estimate and say, maybe right now it's the 85th percentile. Chances that you're ever going to be the 10th percentile is still very slim, right? You kind of have to be confined to solitary, like not seeing anyone for multiple days to maybe feel that way. but we get a sense that says, okay, here's how you generally behave, but also allowing for this dynamic adjustment based on context and situation.
Fascinating. And I wonder, I don't know if I read this in your book or not, but it's just a thought is, as more of our interactions are less physically with other people, but digitally with other people or digitally by ourselves, I would think, at least for myself, that my variance is wider when I am not with other people. Being around other people, I sort of feel like they expect me to be a certain way, and so I'm more likely to be that way.
Could be conformity, yeah.
Is this what you call psychological situations? Are we talking about the same thing?
Yeah. So it's essentially like the more you know about the situation, right? So the more you know that the situation encourages people to be social or to be scared or to be nervous, the more you can also make adjustments to your estimate of who the person is.
Mm-hmm. Gotcha. Okay. So I want to get to, the potential downsides and risks and how companies can think about managing against those. But let's start with the good news. What are some of the good applications of psychological targeting?
Yeah. So for me, there's pretty much for every use case that you can think about in terms of more nefarious purposes, I think there's a good use case, right? So think about selling people stuff that they don't need. You can use it to help people save more. If we can use it to keep people in their echo chambers and just cater to their preferences, you could technically also use it to see, hey, here's stuff that they don't know, but they should know. So expanding their view on the world. My personal favorite is probably the mental health space, just because there's so much opportunity. And I think that the nefarious use case is obvious. I think back in 2015, there was this news story that broke of Facebook predicting whether teenagers were suffering from anxiety and depression, and then selling them out to advertisers. That's obviously not exactly what we want to see. But you could imagine if there's an ability to predict whether someone might be suffering depression, not when they fully enter the depression, but early on, because maybe your kind of phone tells you that they're not leaving the house as much anymore. There's much less physical activity. They're not taking as many calls. You could actually send this early warning signal and say, hey, maybe it's nothing, right? Maybe you're just on vacation, but there seems to be something off. You're deviating from your typical behavior. Why don't you try and get help? And then, of course, I think with all these like conversational agents that we have right now, there's also a lot of opportunity for treatment because there's a huge gap. So for every, I think, 100,000 people looking for a therapist, there's 13 trained professionals. So there's a huge gap. And it's like, and you can imagine that this is average. So the gap gets even wider in certain parts of the world. And it's, again, in an ideal world, if you have access to a great therapist, do you probably want to keep going? Yeah. If you don't have access, or you would just complement your existing therapy, there's so much potential just talking to these agents who can both understand what you might be going through and then also digest everything that we know about psychology and treatment, right? So they're incredibly good at reading scientific papers and then having conversations that follow the manual for here's how to treat PTSD and so on.
So it seems to me like that has a lot to do with the intentions of the organization. And so some organizations, like I think Apple, for example, in my experience as a consumer, has done a good job of positioning itself as a brand that you can trust, that has the right intentions. Meta, not. So what advice do you have for an organization that wants to make sure that they continue doing the right thing?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. So to be clear, there's like different incentives that these companies have, right? So Apple is a B2C, so their end customer is the user. So I think they have an easier time advocating privacy than a company selling data. But the one thing that I've seen companies like Apple do, which I think is a fascinating thought experiment, so the way that they think about it is they call it the evil Steve test, and they just evil Steve. So like now it would be like different, but essentially back in the day when Steve Jobs was the CEO, the idea was, let's imagine we are building this product right now and we're collecting data and for a very specific purpose, right? All our intentions are great. We want to help the consumers have a better experience, have a better product. But let's imagine that tomorrow we get a different CEO with fundamentally different values, but we still feel comfortable collecting the data and setting up the product the way that we're doing right now. And if the answer is no, if the answer, we're worried about collecting all of this user data, because even if we don't abuse it right now, it could be abused in the future, then maybe we just have to go back to the drawing board and do a better job. And I think it's the reason for why I love this thought experiment so much is that typically in the moment, right, everybody's excited about the product. You have the engineers have been working on the coding, and business people see all of the opportunities. So it's very easy to get carried away with the momentum of like, no, we all are aligned in the values and we all want the best for the consumer without necessarily realizing that data that you collect are oftentimes permanent, right? Leadership of companies, of governments are not necessarily the true. So I think it's a nice way of thinking through these potential dark futures in the here and now and baking it into the process so that it just must have that you go through before the product is launched.
And what I found eye-opening in your book, this is probably something that other people know, but for me it was a new idea, that there are safe ways to collect the data so we don't have individual data, but we can still kind of have the benefits of. Can you talk to that a little bit?
Yeah. So there's, and some of it means actually not collecting the data. So I think of it as less is actually more in many cases. So there are technologies now that allow you to essentially extract intelligence without collecting the data. Let me give you an example. Medical space is one that I personally care a lot about because medical data, right, if you think about histories, lifestyle choices, they're like very sensitive data. But also if you were able to pool that data, it could be incredibly helpful, right? We could figure out how disease works. We can figure out which treatments are effective for which group of people and so on. But oftentimes we don't want this data to live in a central place, right? I don't want to send all of my data to a pharma company and then have to trust that there's not going to be a data breach, that's not using it for something that I don't want them to use it for. Yeah, so there's actually this really interesting technology that I think not that many people are talking about, but it allows you to still offer superior personalized products and services without the need to collect the actual user data. And Apple is one of the companies using it. So if you take your iPhone, for example, and the way that Apple trains Siri, so that's the voice and speech recognition software, right? The way that they do it is instead of you sending all of your voice data to a central server of Apple and they process it there, they learn how to recognize your voice, they learn how to train their models. What they do, so they send the model to your phone. Your speech data never leaves its safe harbor. It always stays on your phone. It just gets locally trained because you have a supercomputer in your hands, right? So the phone that you have is so many more times powerful than the rockets that we use to send people to the moon with. And so we can just locally process the data and we can learn how you talk. And then what you do is you send the intelligence back. So instead of sending your data to Apple, you send the intelligence. So they still learn from everybody talking, right? So their model gets improved collectively, but you retain your data and you retain your privacy. So that's a way in which we can build these better products while still kind of safeguarding our data in our hands.
Got it. Excellent. We could double click on that and unpack that further, but I know that we were reaching towards the top of our time with you. And there are a couple things that I want to make sure we also cover. Again, so many questions to ask, but I'm really interested in how this and if this can be applied internally to behavioral change. Like there's one book I'm writing, and it's about companies that adopt customer lifetime value as the primary metric by which they run themselves. And so you can get this data to better distinguish who are high value, low value customers. But then when they want to adopt it, it's hard for them to get behaviors internally to shift because for a number of reasons, but we want to treat all customers well. And so CLV says we should treat them differently. Can we use this to shape internal behavior? And what does that say about the future of culture, management, or change, or whatever you call it?
I think it's such a great question. I've been preaching this for a long time, right? Because we spend so much time, or companies spend so much time and effort trying to understand their customers. What is it that they want? How do we best serve them? And yet they rarely do this internally. And I should say that I do think that there is a slight difference because I think employees are just very attuned to this idea like a company is trying to use the data that we generate to make predictions. So I think internally, which is also true externally, but it's super important to take employees along the way and involve them, right? So instead of just making passive predictions, I would always include them in the process. But we've done some studies which essentially same principles apply, right? Once I can tap into your psychology and understand your motivations, I can also serve you better. So in our case, we actually work with car salespeople and the rewards and recognition platform that they had. So typically, the more cars you sell, the more points you get, and you can put them towards the rewards that are on the platform. Now, there's so many products and services there that you can spend your points on. It's impossible to find something, right? The same as Amazon. It's just overwhelming. You spend way too much time and then you don't find exactly what you need. So what we try to do is we try to measure their personality and then sort the products by what we thought was going to be the most interesting and relevant for them. And what we saw is that by doing that, for the people that were intrinsically motivated, actually boosted the number of cars they sold. So it was like a way of saying, can we translate what we do with customers internally to companies to just, again, do the same? Not all employees are going to be motivated by the same rewards, by the same policies. How do we make it such that we speak really to each and every individual?
Yeah. And I imagine like the relationship, therefore, that a company has, a customer has with a brand, and that an employee has with an employer becomes very different, because I have the idea, whether I'm in the employer brand of Apple, let's say, or the customer brand of Apple, I think of Apple as a persona, as a identity. But now we can have such different relationships. That person can be, going back to the very beginning, we're different people. That brand could be different people to different people in different situations.
And I think if that is done in a very transparent way, right? It's the company saying, look, I want to try and make your experience as best as I can. Here's the stuff that I would like to know about you. You tell me what you want to tell me, but here's what I can do with it. And I think that becomes a totally different story than just like the passive targeting that we see in the consumer space.
So we had Stefan Meyer on, and I loved his concept of the customer is the new, the employee is the new customer. And I see completely the application of all your work there internally and the way it can shape how organizations organize. Okay, we're reaching really the top of our time with you. I also have like two last questions. And, a lot of your work has come up in the work that I got to do with our friend Rob Walcott on proximity. And I absolutely see this being a example of proximity.
Yeah, it's just getting closer and closer, right? So you can essentially create all of these experiences personalized in real time in a way that was traditionally limited to the face-to-face context. And now we can do it scalable for millions of people at the same time.
What are the capabilities that organizations need to start thinking about establishing, or habits or principles, or what needs to start changing internally for them to shift towards headed to where things look like they're going?
So in my opinion, essentially, I think most companies have figured out that AI is going to be the future in some way or another. I don't think it can be a siloed function, right? So I think the same way that we have people potentially thinking about sustainability across the entire company, I think we need to do the same thing for AI. Someone in HR needs to understand how AI works. Someone in marketing needs to understand it in finance. And that's how you, first of all, kind of embed it really both internally into the culture, but also into product. And you also have different people thinking about, well, is this still aligned with the values that we have? So it's not just like the siloed function that gets called on to make the tech work, but it's something that really gets embedded in the culture and in the thinking of every person.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I don't think that's great that you bring that up, because I don't think organizations are yet there. I think that's awesome. Last question. How can people continue to connect with you, learn from you? Of course, as soon as it's out, which will be January 7th, 2025, they should get MINDMASTERS, the data-driven science of predicting and changing human behavior. What else can people do to continue learning from you?
Yeah, so my husband and I recently set up the Advanced Technology and Human Performance Lab at Columbia Business School. So we have a website, human-performance.ai. And there we try to collect a lot of the insights that we read about, the insights that we generate through talks, lectures, and so on. So that's another way.
Awesome. Well, thank you for doing that for us. Thank you for all the work that you've put into leading up to this book and continuing. And thanks for taking some time to sit down with us and share with us. Sandra, it was really great talking to you.
Thank you so much for having me.